The morning Nora Calloway agreed to marry Jonas Holt, she owned exactly 4 things. A carpetbag with a broken clasp, held shut by a strip of rawhide she'd found in the road. A cotton dress that had started its life as blue and faded to something closer to the color of old dishwater. A gold locket containing a portrait of her mother, too scratched now to show any real likeness. And $7.32, which she'd counted 3 times that morning on the edge of the cot in the back room of Dunmore's boarding house, as if the numbers might change. They didn't. She was 24 years old and she had $7. "You don't have to decide today," said Mrs. Pepper from the doorway. The landlady was a small woman with a permanent expression of careful sympathy, the kind that came from watching too many people pass through hard times without being able to do anything useful about it. "Reverend Ashby said Mr. Holt isn't the type to rush. He's also not the type to come to town himself," Nora said. She was looking out the narrow window at the main street of Harlan's Crossing, New Mexico, watching a motorcar rattle past a horse-drawn freight wagon. 2 eras sharing the same dust. He sent a reverend to negotiate on his behalf. "That tells me something. It tells you he has trouble with stairs." Nora turned. "Does it, Mrs.?" Pepper's expression shifted slightly. "The accident was 3 years ago, caught in a collapsed mine shaft," they said. "His back was never right after. He uses a cane now, and he can manage flat ground well enough, but stairs and certain things cause him difficulty." She paused. "He's not a bad man, Nora. He's just had bad luck." Nora thought about that. She thought about her own bad luck, which had arrived in the form of her father's death 6 months ago, followed almost immediately by the discovery that her father had borrowed extensively against the family's dry goods business without telling anyone, including her. The creditors had been polite about it, which was almost worse than if they'd been cruel. Polite people didn't leave room to be angry at them. They just handed you documents and waited while you signed away everything you'd grown up believing was yours. She thought about the 3 months after that, working as a telegraph operator in Santa Fe, until the office manager decided he didn't need to keep paying a woman when 2 of his regular operators came back from working the railroad line. She thought about the journey to Harlan's Crossing on the recommendation of a woman she'd met on a stagecoach who'd sworn there was work here. There wasn't, or not for her. Not anything that would outrun the cost of the boarding house room and the meals she was trying to stretch into something sustainable. $7.32. Winter coming fast off the mountains. A landlady with a kind face who would eventually need the room back. "Tell Reverend Ashby yes," Nora said. The ceremony took place 3 days later in the same church where, Nora was told, Jonas Holt had been baptized 38 years ago. The building was simple enough. Whitewashed adobe, a wooden cross above the door, glass in the windows that was just clear enough to let in light but too wavy to see through properly. 7 people attended. Nora recognized none of them. She heard him before she saw him. The sound was distinct, the measured strike of a cane on flagstone, and beneath it, a gait that wasn't quite even. A careful deliberateness that spoke of a man who'd had to relearn every step. She was standing at the front of the church when he came through the door, and she made herself turn and look directly at him, because she'd decided on the walk over that there would be no flinching. Whatever this man looked like, whatever his damage, she had agreed to this arrangement with clear eyes, and she would keep them clear. Jonas Holt was tall enough that the cane looked almost incongruous, like something that belonged to a smaller, older man. His shoulders were broad. His hair was dark brown, threaded through with gray at the temples, and his face had the kind of deep-set lines that came from years of outdoor work and recent years of pain. His jaw was set. His eyes, when they found her, were the gray-green color of the mountains on a cloudy day, and they held approximately the warmth of that same sky. He looked at her the way a man looked at a contract he wasn't sure he should have signed. She looked back at him the same way. Reverend Ashby spoke about covenant and about the frontier spirit, and about how 2 people building a life together honored God's intention for human community. Nora listened with one part of her mind and used the other part to study the man beside her. He was in pain. She could see it in the controlled stillness he held himself in, the way he'd planted his cane and wasn't moving unless he had to, the faint tension around his eyes that had nothing to do with the ceremony and everything to do with whatever his back was doing to him at that moment. He'd made an effort. His shirt was clean, his boots were polished, his hair had been combed, but the effort had cost him something. Stubborn, she thought. That was going to be a problem. "Do you, Jonas Holt, take this woman as your lawfully wedded wife?" I do. His voice was lower than she'd expected. Not unfriendly, exactly. Just sparse. A man who chose his words the way someone else might choose how to spend their last few dollars. And do you, Nora Calloway, take this man as your lawfully wedded husband? She looked at his profile. He was staring straight ahead. His knuckles were white around the head of his cane. He was waiting for her to finish this transaction so he could sit down. I do, she said. The rings were plain silver bands, simple as everything else about the arrangement. His hand was large and calloused when she put the ring on his finger, with old scarring across the back of his knuckles from something she couldn't identify. A man who had built things. A man who had been broken doing it. The kiss he pressed to her forehead was brief and impersonal, the kind you'd give a stranger whose hand you'd shaken one too many times. Then he turned toward the door. Nora followed. That seemed to be how this was going to work. He drove the wagon himself on the road out to the property, handling the reins with quiet competence despite everything. They didn't speak for the first 20 minutes. The land around Harlan's Crossing opened up fast once you left the main road's scrubby high desert, giving way to better grassland, as the altitude dropped slightly, the mountains pulling away to the north and west, the sky doing that thing it did in New Mexico where it became enormous, in a way that was equal parts beautiful and slightly terrifying. There are rules, Jonas said finally. All right. The sky did it was a great. Your room is the second door on the left upstairs. Mine is downstairs. You don't come into my space without an invitation. I don't come into yours. That's not negotiable. Your room is the second door on the left. I don't come into my space without an invitation. Understood. The mine hasn't operated in 3 years. We run cattle now. 60 head, moving toward 80 if the spring calving goes well. There's also a small orchard that you can do whatever you want with. I haven't had time. She glanced at him. The orchard detail seemed oddly personal for a list of rules. I'll pay you $40 a month, he continued, for the household. Cooking, cleaning, whatever needs doing inside. Anything outside is my business and my hired man Cutter's business, and you don't need to involve yourself. $40 a month. More than her telegraph operator wage. She said nothing. I don't talk much in the evenings. I want to make that clear before you expect something different. I grew up with a father who could talk the ears off a fence post, Nora said. Quiet sounds fine to me. That seemed to surprise him. He didn't look at her, but something around his jaw shifted slightly. Good. They rode the rest of the way in silence that felt, if not comfortable, at least honest. The property appeared as they came around a low ridge, a main house of stone and timber that was larger than she'd expected. A barn, several outbuildings, a small stand of apple trees that was the orchard he'd mentioned, their leaves gone to October gold. Everything looked solid and well built, the kind of construction meant to outlast the man who'd ordered it. But there was a neglected quality to it, like a coat that needed brushing. Things that should have been painted hadn't been. The fence along the drive had posts that had shifted and weren't quite plumb. The yard needed work. She could see in his profile that he knew it, and couldn't fix it fast enough, and hated that. Inside, the house was spare and almost aggressively practical. Stone fireplace. Good kitchen with an iron range that looked relatively modern. A front room with 2 chairs and a bookcase stuffed with volumes that someone had actually read. The spines were cracked, pages dog-eared. No decoration, no rugs except one worn thing in front of the fireplace. It felt inhabited, but barely, like he was camping in his own life. Pantry's stocked, he said. Root cellar is through the kitchen. Well water, not town water, so check the bucket before you draw. He paused at the door to what must be his room. There's a lamp on your dresser. Oil's in the kitchen cabinet. He went inside. She heard the careful descent of a man lowering himself onto a bed with his back, the way his back was. Then silence, except for something that might have been a long and controlled exhale of pain. Nora stood in the front room with her carpetbag at her feet and looked at the bookcase. It told her more about Jonas Holt than anything said during the ceremony or the wagon ride. There were engineering manuals next to Dickens, next to a Texas almanac, next to what looked like 3 years' worth of mining journals. A man who read everything. A man who used to need to know a great many different things. She picked up her bag and found her room. The first week passed in careful parallel. Nora learned the rhythms of the house. Jonas rose before dawn, which she could hear from her room, The slow and deliberate sounds of a man managing a body that didn't cooperate well in the early cold. He was outside by the time she had breakfast ready. He came in at noon without being called, ate with focused efficiency, said whatever was practically necessary, and went back out. Supper at 7. After supper he read, or sat in the chair by the fire doing something that looked very much like nothing, which she suspected was actually the exhausted aftermath of a day that cost him more than he'd ever admit. On the 5th day, she found the account books. She hadn't been looking for them. She'd been trying to find the warranty paperwork for the kitchen range, which had developed a temperamental quality with the left burner, and she'd been searching the drawer of the desk in the front room. The account books were in the back of the drawer, underneath a folded survey map and some old correspondence. She wouldn't have opened them except that the top one had slipped and fallen open, and she'd seen the numbers almost by accident. Then she'd seen the name written in the margins, over and over, in handwriting that wasn't Jonas's blocky print. D. Pruitt. Per Pruitt. Handled by Pruitt. Pruitt. Arranged. She didn't know who Pruitt was yet, but she knew what she was looking at. She'd watched her father's business partner do something very similar in the months before her father got sick. A slow and careful repositioning of numbers, not enough to alarm in any individual entry, but adding up over time to something that went somewhere it shouldn't. She put the books back exactly as she'd found them and finished looking for the range warranty, which she didn't find. That evening, she said, as casually as she could manage, "I heard someone in town mention a man named Pruitt. Does he have land near here?" Jonas looked up from his book. His face told her nothing, but the half-second pause before he answered told her something. Clarence Pruitt. He runs the Harlan's Crossing Mercantile Bank. Why? Just a name I heard. Someone said he was involved in the mining business. He financed a lot of operations out here, yes, including this one, once upon a time. Jonas returned to his book, but she noticed he didn't turn any pages for the next several minutes. She filed it away and said nothing more. 2 days later, Pruitt came to the house himself. Nora was in the orchard, attempting to salvage the last of the October apples before the frost took them completely, when she heard the automobile. It was a newer model than most she'd seen in Harlan's Crossing, black and well-maintained, and it came up the drive with the confidence of someone who'd driven it up this drive many times before. The man who got out was perhaps 50, with silver at his temples and a suit that fit him with the precision of something made to measure. He had a broad, pleasant face that smiled easily, and eyes that catalogued everything in the yard before his expression had finished settling into welcome. "Mrs. Holt," he said, crossing toward her with his hand extended. "Clarence Pruitt. I don't believe we've been formally introduced." She shook his hand. His grip was practiced firm without aggression, held just a moment too long. "Mr. Pruitt, I heard Jonas had married. Wanted to come offer my congratulations." His eyes moved over her with an assessment that was subtle enough to be almost unnoticeable. Almost. "How are you finding Harlan's Crossing?" "Still. Finding my way around," she said carefully. Of course. It's a different life out here, especially for someone from the city." She hadn't told him she was from a city. "I hope Jonas is well, taking care of you. He can be somewhat difficult to read." "We're managing." Pruitt's smile didn't change. "I'm glad to hear it. I worry about him, frankly. This operation is more than one man should handle alone, especially given," he paused, tilting his head with an expression of regret, so perfectly calibrated it was almost artistic, given his limitations. "I've tried to help where I can, handle some of the banking matters, the supply contracts, anything to ease the burden." "That's very generous of you," Nora said. "What else do you do for an old friend?" He spread his hands. "Though I'll tell you honestly, between us, and I say this with nothing but concern, the property has been struggling." "Has Jonas discussed the financial situation with you?" "We're still settling in." "Of course." His eyes moved to the house, the barn, the fence line. "Well, if you ever feel the need to discuss things, or if you find yourself wondering about certain realities of the situation, my door is always open. To you specifically." A small, meaningful pause. Sometimes an outside perspective is helpful, especially for a new wife who wants to understand what she's married into. He left 20 minutes later, after declining her offer of coffee with a warmth that felt like he'd invented warmth personally. Nora stood watching the motor car diminish down the drive and felt the particular cold that had nothing to do with the October air. At supper, she told Jonas, His fork went still halfway through the motion of reaching for the salt. What exactly did he say? She repeated it precisely. She had a good memory for words. It had made her a good telegraph operator, the ability to hold a message intact in her mind until she could get it to the wire. Jonas listened without interrupting. When she finished, he set down his fork and looked at the table for a long moment. Pruitt has been handling my supply contracts and loan negotiations since the accident, he said. I couldn't travel the way I used to. Couldn't get to the bank in Albuquerque. Couldn't sit a horse for any real distance. He offered to help. I was, a pause, grateful. Thought I was. The account book's in the desk, Nora said. His name is in the margins of quite a few entries. Jonas went very still. You looked at my books. The drawer was open. One fell. I saw the first page by accident. She held his eyes. But I'd like to look at the rest of them, if you'll let me. My father ran a dry goods business for 20 years. I kept his books for the last 7 of them. I know what accounts look like when they're healthy, and I know what they look like when someone's been helping themselves along the way. He studied her for a long time. The firelight picked up the lines in his face, the gray at his temples, the set of his jaw that she was learning to read as a kind of internal argument he was having with himself about whether to trust someone. Why would you do that? He said finally. You've been here 8 days. Because if someone is running your finances into the ground, it becomes my problem too, she said. I didn't trade one sinking ship for another. I'd like to know what I'm actually dealing with. Something shifted in his expression. Not softness, exactly. More like the recalibration of someone who'd expected less. He pushed back from the table and went to the desk, returning with both account books and a third one she hadn't found, slimmer, older. Start with this one, he said, setting the old, slim ledger in front of her. That's from before. She worked through them that evening while Jonas read on the other side of the fire. The older book was clear and orderly. Jonas's handwriting, meticulous, a mining operation generating consistent and reasonable income, expenses that made sense. Then the accident, which appeared in the ledger only as an abrupt change in who was making the entries. And after that, Pruitt's handwriting in the margins, and numbers that began, slowly and carefully, to drift. The supply costs increased. Not dramatically, never enough to raise an immediate alarm, just consistently upward. Contracts with cattle buyers that should have renewed didn't, replaced by new arrangements at worse terms. A loan that had been at a reasonable rate for 7 years was somehow renegotiated to a higher one 18 months ago with no apparent reason. Every place Pruitt's name appeared in the margin, money left the operation. How much does he know about your financial position? She asked. Jonas looked up from his book. Everything. He handles the banknotes. He has power of attorney for property transactions. A pause. I gave it to him after the accident because I couldn't. He stopped. Because you couldn't get to Albuquerque yourself. Yes. Nora set down the book. Jonas. Power of attorney means he can sign your name to property transactions. The silence that followed was complete. He could sell this land, she said carefully, without you present. If he could establish that you were incapacitated, or that you'd agreed to a sale. He couldn't forge my agreement. He couldn't need to. If the debt level gets high enough, and if the income keeps dropping, a court could determine you're insolvent and authorize a sale to cover the debts. And the bank that holds your notes would have considerable influence over which buyer that court authorized. She met his eyes. Who owns the Harlan's Crossing Mercantile Bank, Jonas? He said nothing for a moment. Then, very quietly, Clarence Pruitt. She'd known that was coming, but hearing it still felt like a stone dropping. He's been engineering the debt, inflating your costs, canceling your contracts, quietly worsening your terms. When the numbers get bad enough, the bank forecloses, the court authorizes a sale, and he buys your land at whatever price he offers, because no one else will touch a property in foreclosure. This is my father's land, Jonas said. His voice had gone flat in a way that was much more frightening than anger. My grandfather staked the original claim. I was born in this house. I know. If Pruitt, he stopped again. I need proof. What I have right now is a pattern and a suspicion. Then we get proof. She stacked the ledgers neatly. The contract cancellations, do you have the names of the buyers who backed out? Some of them. I want to write to them. Ask them directly why they withdrew. Not accusingly. Just a new wife getting familiar with the business. wanting to understand the history of the operation. Jonas studied her again with that same recalibrating expression. "You're good at this. I'm good at numbers, and I grew up watching a man I trusted steal from my father by degrees," she said. "I learned what to look for." They worked at the table for 2 more hours, Nora making notes in a separate notebook, Jonas providing names and dates and whatever details he could recall from the months after the accident, when everything had started quietly going wrong. She noticed, at some point, that the tension around his eyes had changed. It was still pain that didn't leave him entirely. She was beginning to understand, but it had mixed with something else. Something that might have been relief at not carrying this alone. She didn't say anything about that, but she noticed. Pruitt came back a week later with a man she didn't recognize, heavy-set and official-looking, who he introduced as an assessor from the county land office. "Routine revaluation," Pruitt said, with his practiced pleasantness. "Property values have shifted in the area. We want to make sure everything's properly recorded." Jonas was in the barn. Nora met them on the porch. "I'm afraid today isn't convenient," she said. "My husband is occupied, and I'd need him present for any official assessment of the property." Pruitt's pleasant expression developed a very slight edge. "It's just a formality, Mrs. Holt. Shouldn't take more than an hour. Then it will be just as easy to arrange for a convenient time." She smiled at both of them. "I'll send word to your office Monday. We can set a date." The assessor looked at Pruitt. Something passed between them that was too quick and too controlled to read clearly. Pruitt turned the pleasant expression back to full brightness. "Of course," he said. "Monday, then." After they left, Nora went to the barn and told Jonas what had happened. He listened, leaning against the stall door with his cane, and his jaw worked in the way she'd learned meant he was deciding whether to be furious or strategic. "He's accelerating," Jonas said. "Whatever he's planning, he's moving faster. Because I'm here." She kept her voice level. "He came out here expecting to find you alone and struggling. Instead, he found a wife who looks at his numbers and asks questions. So you've made yourself a target. So we've made each other harder to deal with." She leaned against the opposite stall door. "The letter I sent to Roy Caswell, the cattle buyer in Tucson who canceled your contract in April," he wrote back. Jonas looked at her sharply. "Already?" "He's a prompt man, apparently." She pulled the letter from her apron pocket. Caswell had written that he'd been contacted by a representative of Pruitt's bank 6 weeks before he canceled Jonas's contract. The representative had informed him that Jonas Holt was in poor health, that his operation was likely to become insolvent within the season, and that any beef contracted through Holt would carry significant financial risk. Caswell had believed it. He was, he wrote, sorry to hear things had turned out differently, and he would be pleased to discuss a new arrangement. Jonas read the letter twice. When he looked up, the flatness in his voice from before had resolved into something colder and more precise. "That's fraud, misrepresentation to a business contact to deliberately damage my commercial relationships. That's one letter from one buyer." Nora folded it carefully. "I've written to 3 others. We wait for those responses. We document what we have. And we take it to someone with the authority to act on it. Pruitt has relationships with every official in Harlan's Crossing. He doesn't have relationships with the Territorial Marshal's office in Santa Fe." She met his eyes. "I worked in that telegraph office for 3 months. I know the senior operator there. If I send him a message directly, it doesn't pass through anyone in this county first." Jonas was quiet for a long moment. "You planned this." "I planned to have options. There's a difference." Something changed in his face then. Not a smile, not quite, but the shadow of one, the first she'd seen from him. It changed his entire face, actually. Made him look younger and tired and human. "Where did you come from, Nora Calloway?" "Calloway's Dry Goods, Socorro, New Mexico," she said. "Until 6 months ago." He nodded slowly. "We'll do it your way." The next response letter came 4 days later, and then the third 2 days after that. Both confirmed the same pattern, a representative from Pruitt's bank, reaching out before the contract cancellations with carefully worded warnings about Jonas Holt's health and solvency, building the same false narrative in multiple places, making sure that when the operation finally collapsed, it would look inevitable to everyone who'd watched it happen. Nora assembled the letters alongside her notes from the ledgers, building a timeline that was methodical and clear. She was good at this, as Jonas had said. Her father had called it her talent for seeing the shape of things, not just individual numbers, but the architecture underneath them, the the structure of intention that individual entries were arranged to disguise. That was when Pruitt made his real move. He came on a Thursday morning with 2 men from his bank and a document he called a friendly restructuring of the outstanding loan balance. The numbers on the document represented a fundamental change to the terms of Jonas's original note, one that would require a lump payment within 60 days that Jonas couldn't make, which would trigger a default provision that would transfer management of the property to the bank during the resolution period. Management of the property. To the bank. That Pruitt owned. Nora stood in the front room and looked at the document and felt the pieces click into their final positions. This was the end of his plan. Not a dramatic moment, just a piece of paper pushed across a table by a pleasant man in a good suit, and suddenly Jonas would be out of his father's land without a shot being fired. "We'll need time to review this." "With our attorney?" she said. "Of course." Pruitt's voice carried absolute confidence. "Take all the time you need. The 60-day window is quite generous." After they left, she sent the wire to Santa Fe. The territorial marshal sent a deputy named Haynes, a quiet man in his 40s who looked like someone's grandfather and listened with the focus of a man who'd heard many stories and could tell the difference between the ones that held together and the ones that didn't. He sat in the front room for 3 hours going through Nora's documentation, the letters from the buyers, the annotated ledgers, the restructuring document with its predatory terms, the power of attorney that should never have been granted, and which Haynes noted immediately carried anomalies in the notarization. "This notary stamp," he said, holding the power of attorney to the light. "You see how the ink bleeds at the edge here? That's a copied stamp. Whoever made this didn't use the original seal." Jonas leaned forward. "What does that mean?" "It means Mr. Holt may never have actually signed a valid power of attorney at all." Haynes set the document down. "Which means every transaction Pruitt conducted under its authority is potentially fraudulent." The silence that followed was the particular quality of something important settling into place. "Can you prove the mine accident was deliberate?" Haynes asked. Jonas shook his head. "I was underground when the support failed. I've thought about it since the timing was odd. I'd mentioned to Pruitt the week before that I was considering selling a portion of the eastern acreage to a different buyer. He was the only one who knew I'd be in that section of the shaft that morning. But I can't prove it." "You may not need to," Haynes said. "What you have here is sufficient for fraud charges." Multiple counts. Combined with the attempted foreclosure through what appears to be a forged legal document, I can bring this to a federal judge. He looked at both of them. "However, Pruitt will know you've reached out to us. And men who've built something like this don't generally dismantle it quietly." "He'll move first," Nora said. "Likely." "Yes." She and Jonas looked at each other across the table. 3 weeks of shared purpose had changed something between them that neither of them had been planning to change. She could read him now, or beginning to know when the flatness in his voice meant he was in pain, knew when the stillness meant he was thinking hard, knew the particular set of his shoulders when he'd made a decision and wouldn't be moved from it. "Then we move faster," Jonas said. Haynes served the papers at Pruitt's bank the following Tuesday morning. Nora had insisted on being in Harlan's Crossing when it happened, and Jonas had insisted on being there with her, which had involved a careful and slightly complicated argument that ended with them both in the wagon at dawn, driving into town together. They were drinking coffee at Clara Whitfield's cafe when they saw Pruitt come out of his bank with Haynes. Even from across the street, Pruitt's pleasantness had finally, completely abandoned him. What was left underneath was less human than Nora had expected. Not rage, exactly. Something colder. The expression of a man who'd been absolutely certain of the outcome of a game and had just been shown he'd lost it. He saw them through the cafe window. For a moment, he simply looked at them. Then he turned and spoke quietly to one of his men, and Nora felt Jonas's hand close around her wrist on the table. "We need to go," he said. They were right. Pruitt's man reached the cafe door before they'd gotten fully to their feet, and he wasn't there to talk. The hard set of his face made that clear. But Haynes was 3 seconds behind him, and the deputy had 30 years of reading situations like this one, and his hand on the man's shoulder was calm and final, and allowed no interpretation other than the correct one. The man stopped. Pruitt was arrested at the door of his own bank, with 4 of his employees as witnesses, which Nora thought, later, was a detail he would find particularly excruciating. The trial took place 6 weeks later in the county courthouse, brought under territorial jurisdiction because of the forged federal notarization. Pruitt had a lawyer from Albuquerque who was skilled and expensive, and did his best with a case that had, at its core, more documentation than most fraud trials produced. The buyer letters, the annotated ledgers, the forged power of attorney. 3 of Pruitt's own former employees who'd been approached by Haynes and found, when facing their own potential liability, to be unexpectedly willing to describe specific instructions they'd received. Nora testified for 2 hours. Pruitt's lawyer tried to characterize her as a woman with financial motivations of her own, a newcomer who'd married into a situation she didn't understand and was now offering opinions about complex business matters that were beyond her expertise. She answered every question without heat and with specific numbers, and she watched at least 4 members of the jury begin to follow her accounting with something that looked like recognition. People who manage their own household budgets understood when money was going somewhere it shouldn't. It wasn't complicated once you saw it clearly. Jonas testified after her. He walked to the stand without his cane, which she knew cost him, and he answered everything in the same sparse, direct way he had of speaking. And when Pruitt's lawyer asked whether it wasn't possible that the financial decline of the operation was simply a result of Jonas's own diminished capacity after the accident, Jonas looked at him for a long, quiet moment. The operation declined in every category where Clarence Pruitt handled the contracts, he said, and held steady or improved in every category I handled myself. You can read that as coincidence if you'd like. Guilty. Fraud in the first degree, forgery of a federal document, criminal interference with commercial contracts. The sentencing added up to something that would keep Clarence Pruitt in a federal penitentiary until he was a very old man, or possibly until he wasn't a man at all anymore. Outside the courthouse, Jonas stood in the November light and said nothing for a long moment. His cane was in his right hand, and his left hand was at his side, and he was looking at something in the middle distance. I should have seen it, he said. Years ago. I should have seen it. He was careful, Nora said. And you were hurt. And people you're hurt, trust the people who seem to be helping them. That's not a character flaw. That's just being human. Jonas looked at her sideways. You're being generous. I'm being accurate. She pulled her coat tighter. The same thing happened to my father. I watched it. It doesn't happen to stupid people or careless people. It happens to people who believe in something in their work, in their land, and trust that the people around them believe in it too. He was quiet. You were right about the orchard, she said, because the silence was getting too heavy. The last of the apples made excellent preserves. I put up 14 jars. He looked at her. Something in his expression was working towards something she hadn't seen from him before. 14. I can show you the inventory, Nora. His voice had changed slightly. Lower. More careful. What happens now? After today? What do you want it to look like? She thought about that. I want to fix the fence along the drive, she said. The posts are out of plumb. And I want to write to Roy Caswell in Tucson and get that cattle contract back. And I want to go through those loan terms with Haynes and make sure we understand what's actually ours and what Pruitt muddied. She paused. And I want to keep doing the accounts, if you'll let me. You're better at cattle than I am, and I'm better at numbers than you are, and that seems like an efficient use of what we each know how to do. That's a plan for the operation, Jonas said. What do you want for yourself? She looked at him directly. The gray-green eyes were doing something different than they usually did, less like a cloudy mountain sky, more like the moment the clouds moved and you saw the actual color beneath them. I want this to be real, she said. I know what it started as. I know why we both agreed to it, and I'm not pretending that was anything other than what it was. But somewhere in the last 6 weeks, she stopped. Finding the ledger, he said. Yes. Writing the letters. Yes. Sitting at that table until midnight building a case out of nothing but bad numbers and stubbornness. Yes, she said. All of it. It became I started. She was not usually someone who couldn't finish sentences. She tried again. I want to stay, she said. Not because I need to. Because I want to. Jonas looked at her for a long time. The courthouse door opened behind them, and several people came out, talking loudly, separating around them without notice. Neither of them moved. I don't know how to do this, he said. I thought I did. Once. Margaret, my first she left when things got difficult after the accident. I always believed it was because she saw something in me that wasn't worth staying for. It wasn't that, Nora said. People leave because they're scared, not because the person they're leaving is worthless. Those are two different things. You don't know why she left? No. But I know why I'm staying. She held his gaze. And it's not the fence posts. He laughed. It was sudden and real, and it transformed his face completely. The way she'd seen briefly before in the barn, younger, human, genuinely himself behind all the armor he'd been wearing so long he'd probably forgotten it was armor. 14 jars, he said. It was a good apple season. He reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, just carefully, the way he did everything deliberate and real. His hand was warm and his grip was neither too tight nor too tentative, the grip of a man who'd decided something and meant it. Then we stay, he said. Both of us. For the real version. They drove home as the sun dropped behind the mountains and painted the desert in colors that belonged in a painting nobody could have made. The wagon moved along the road that had become familiar to her now. Every rut and rise of it, the way the land changed in the last mile before the property, the apple trees visible first as silhouettes and then as something more specific. The fence posts were still out of plumb. She was going to fix that. The accounts were in order in her notebook, clear and documented, and come spring, the cattle operation would have real contracts with honest buyers at honest prices. She'd see to that too. Jonas drove without speaking, which she no longer read as distance, but as what it actually was. A man comfortable enough with someone to let the silence exist without filling it. His cane was on the seat between them, and his bad days would still be bad. The back damage was permanent, and she understood that now, in its full dimension. But the worst of them she'd sit with him through, and the best of them they'd spend on the things worth spending them on. The house appeared on the hill with lamplight in the window. She'd left a lamp before they went to town, some instinct toward homecoming. When I was in the mine, Jonas said, his eyes on the road, and I understood that the support had failed and I couldn't get out on my own, I thought that was the end of the story. I thought nothing worth having would come after that. And now? And now I think the story I thought I was living in was too small, he said simply. This one is bigger. She took his hand where it rested on his knee. He turned his palm up and held hers, and they drove the last quarter mile like that, two people who'd started as a desperate arrangement and ended up as something neither of them had language for yet, but both of them recognized without any doubt at all. The door opened to warmth and the smell of the apple preserves she'd put up the week before. 14 jars in a row on the kitchen shelf, ordinary and real and entirely theirs. She'd fought for harder things than happiness. She knew now that happiness was not something that happened to you in the absence of hardship. It was something you built from the hardship, jar by jar, ledger entry by ledger entry, day by careful day, alongside someone who showed up for the unglamorous work of it. They'd earned this, both of them. That made it real in a way that easy things could never be. Sometimes the life we're forced into turns out to be the one we were meant to find. Nora didn't choose desperation. And she didn't choose Jonas, but she chose what to do with both of them. Every single day. That's the part that matters. Real security isn't something handed to you. It's something you build, carefully, alongside someone willing to do the hard work with you. A small note for you. This story was created and fictionalized by AI, crafted to bring you a moment of entertainment and, hopefully, a little warmth worth